American journalism is in grave peril. Well, we've heard that refrain before from commentators and academics, but now the warning comes from a top official charged with regulating the press. In a speech tomorrow at Columbia University, Federal Communications Commissioner Michael Copps will argue that media consolidation has damaged democracy, and he'll offer a plan to reverse the trend. Commissioner Copps visited our studio this afternoon. Commissioner, you describe American journalism as in what you call its hour of grave peril. That's a pretty serious condemnation.
It's a pretty serious situation that we're in. I think American media has a bad case of substance abuse right now. We are not producing the body of news and information that democracy needs to conduct its civic dialogue. We're not producing as much news as we did 5 years, 10 years, 15 years ago. And we have to reverse that trend, or I think we are going to be pretty close to denying our citizens the essential news and information that they need to have in order to make intelligent decisions about the future direction of their country. So what you've called for to redress this situation is what you're calling a public value test. Doesn't that raise the spectre of overt government control of information? I mean, people would say to you, well, what one person's public value is not another person's. What we've had in recent years is an aberration where we have had no oversight of the media. For years and years we had some public interest guidelines that was part of the quid pro quo between broadcasters and the government for the free use of airwaves that belong to the American people. And in return for that free use and the ability to make a lot of money, they agreed to serve the public interest. And that public interest to me right now is crying news and information, news and information, news and information. But what happens if one channel comes to you and says, I'm sorry, Commissioner, but your value is not my value, it's not my opinion? It's not that kind of a value. What we're talking about is, are you producing news? Are you putting more resources into news and information? Are you talking to members of your community of license about what kind of programming interests them? You know, we're such a diverse country now, and we used to always require broadcasters, when they lived in the town and went to the local barber shop and the grocer, we still said you have to have some discussions with the members of your community to see what their interests and concerns are. Now we have a situation where so many stations are owned by absentee owners hundreds or thousands of miles away. That requirement is gone. So this is just a minimal assertion of the public interest, and it's implementing the deal that broadcasters always abided by. You know, we didn't have that great Edward R. Murrow generation of journalism in this country just out of the generosity of broadcasters' hearts. They knew that that was part of the deal, that they were expected to do that, and that the FCC was watching. And I'm not saying we did a goldenly wonderful job of implementing that, but at least they knew that and I've had people, Walter Cronkite and many others, tell me that that's exactly what the situation was. We've moved way beyond the age of Murrow and Cronkite now. You're having to deal, for example, with the internet, with the whole massive range of digital communications. What can and should the FCC be doing when it comes to digital news? All right, we've been talking so far about traditional media, and I'm making some specific suggestions for that. But you're right, we are going to transition a lot of this news and information to the internet. Unfortunately, there are no online models that have appeared to support real investigative journalism, which is fast disappearing elsewhere. And most of the news that is produced in this country, probably 80 or 90%, comes from the traditional media, newspapers and broadcast. So we have to make sure that we are planning for the transition to new media. The first requirement, the first prerequisite, is to make sure that internet is open, that we have internet freedom or net neutrality or wherever you want to call it. If our future town square is going to be paved with broadband breaks, if we're really going digital, we have to make sure that everybody has access to that town square and walks on those bricks if we're going to be able to conduct that civic dialogue, which is so important to the future of our nation. And that was Commissioner Copps.
Now, for some, WikiLeaks and its avalanche of US diplomatic cables is the gift that just keeps on giving. For others, especially if you're a US diplomat, it's the embarrassment that just keeps on coming. The latest batch reveals Afghan and American criticism of British forces and their strategy in Helmand in 2008. According to the cables released by the British paper The Guardian, the American embassy in Kabul said that the US and the Afghan president, Hamid Karzai, believed that British forces were not up to the job of securing Helmand during the Afghan presidential elections. Our defence correspondent Caroline Wyatt has this report.
Today, US forces are fighting and dying in Helmand province, where British troops have battled since 2006. But according to confidential US cables revealed by WikiLeaks and released by The Guardian tonight, the US and the Afghan government in 2008 were deeply critical of the UK's performance in Helmand. One cable has the Afghan president, Hamid Karzai, telling a US senator that some in Helmand had asked him to take the British away and give us back the Americans instead. Also that year, the US Embassy told Washington that without extra American and Afghan forces, we and Karzai agree the British are not up to the task of securing Helmand for the Afghan elections the next August. While the Afghan foreign minister expressed his disappointment with British soldiers, who he said were not ready to fight as actively as Americans.
The assertion that the British aren't prepared to fight as actively as Americans, I mean, that's just not true, and the facts don't bear that out. There is a cohesive pulling together of the Americans and the British as the core of NATO, and we shouldn't allow that very factual position to be distracted from by the leaking of documents which, quite frankly, are not helpful to anyone, not least the poor British or American soldier who are slugging their guts out to try and prove the lot of the Afghans in places like Helmand province.
The then NATO commander, General Dan McNeill, is described in 2007 as saying of the British that there'd been a lot of action on counter-narcotics but little progress, and that he was particularly dismayed by the British effort. They'd made a mess of things in Helmand. Anthony Phillipson, whose son James was one of the first to be killed when British forces went into Sangin in June 2006, is dismayed by the sentiments revealed in these cables.
At least we went in there. We've done the best we could with some of the finest infantry in the world. We've taken terrible casualties. And yes, the place is still a hotbed of violence, but I think it always will be.
Much of this criticism has been heard before. British tactics in the most lethal areas such as Sangin are also questioned in the cables amid disagreements over the best approach to take. And 2 years ago, British commanders themselves were making clear they wanted more troops and more resources to counter the insurgency in Helmand. And some of the US criticism might be more muted today. The American surge has seen the US Marines who took over in Sangin suffer some of their highest casualties there too, losing 16 men in a matter of weeks. Caroline Wyatt, BBC News.
It's been 2 months now since British aid worker Linda Norgrove died in Afghanistan. And today came confirmation that she was killed by a grenade thrown by a US soldier. The accident happened during an attempt to free Norgrove from the captors who abducted her in an ambush, and now disciplinary action has been taken against the Special Forces unit involved. The BBC's Frank Gardner reports.
Linda Norgrove, the 36-year-old British aid worker, killed in Afghanistan in October. Not by her Islamist kidnappers, as was first announced, but accidentally by a grenade thrown by one of her US rescuers. In Parliament, Britain's Foreign Secretary William Hague announced the official findings of the joint US-British investigation.
The investigation team found that the failure to disclose information that a grenade was thrown breached US military law. As a result, members of the rescue team have been disciplined for failing to provide a complete and full account of their actions in accordance with US military procedure.
In the remote province of Kunar, around 1,000 US and Afghan troops went looking for Ms. Norgrove, kidnapped in late September. They tracked her down to a small cluster of buildings. The British government gave the go-ahead for a rescue attempt when it was feared she could be passed on to jihadist extremists. 2 helicopters full of troops took off in terrain similar to this, landing in almost total darkness. They soon came under fire. A US serviceman threw a grenade in self-defense, unaware of how close he was to Ms. Norgrove.
It really is a pleasure to be here with the...
When General David Petraeus, the US and NATO commander in Afghanistan, came to London soon afterwards, his visit was overshadowed by the confusion over Norgrove's death. Now the facts are known. In the Western Isles of Scotland, Ms. Norgrove's parents are still coming to terms with her death. Despite what's happened, they've paid tribute to the bravery of the US team that so nearly succeeded in rescuing their daughter alive. Both the US and Britain say the kidnappers were ultimately responsible for her death. Frank Gardner, BBC News.
Welcome back to BBC World News America. Whether it's in China, Canada, Italy, Pakistan or Britain, the avalanche of unvarnished honesty, courtesy of WikiLeaks, is keeping US diplomats very busy indeed. Like a randomly spreading wildfire, all week they've been dousing the flames, smoothing ruffled feathers. Today, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton told the BBC that she deeply regretted the suggestion, which we reported last night, that Washington didn't value the sacrifice of British troops in Afghanistan. And tonight there is new material lifting the veil on that special relationship between the US and the UK. The BBC's World Affairs editor, John Simpson, has this report.
And that is Westminster Hall.
David Cameron showing Barack Obama around Westminster. All British and American leaders since 1945 have been condemned to seem friendly. America may often be patronising, but it needs its usually uncritical main ally just as much as Britain has a painful need to be reassured. A WikiLeaks quote from the US Embassy, released by The Guardian tonight, sums it up neatly. Though tempting to argue that keeping Her Majesty's government off balance about its current standing with us might make London more willing to respond favourably when pressed for assistance, in the long run it's not in US interests. The criticisms of Britain's performance in Afghanistan have, of course, been particularly painful. We and President Karzai agree, said one of the American WikiLeaks documents, that without extra forces, the British are not up to the task of securing Helmand. Yet the Obama administration is so embarrassed by this that Hillary Clinton apologized profusely for it today in a BBC interview.
I personally want to convey to the government and the people of the United Kingdom both our deep respect and admiration for the extraordinary efforts and our regret if anything that was said by anyone suggests to the contrary.
What have we learned from the welter of leaked documents this week? To be honest, not a huge amount. British generals complain just as much about American ones as Americans do about the British. Saudi Arabia would like America to bomb Iran? Well, awkward maybe, but we guessed it already. North Korea has been the solitary major surprise. The suggestion that China wouldn't mind seeing Korea reunited under South Korea was a real eye-opener. But the main problem is that the leaks have embarrassed the diplomats.
It harms the principle of confidentiality of diplomatic relations, which is an essential element of our diplomacy. And I'm sure there are some leaders seeing material published about themselves who will think twice about how candidly they will speak to us on future occasions.
So what's happening about the chief leaker, Julian Assange, who appeared on The Guardian website today? Well, it'll be 10 days before any action can be taken on the remarkably coincidental extradition bid against him from Sweden. And in case he disappears from the scene, he says, he's passed the rest of the material to thousands of other people. John Simpson, BBC News.
Well, as John mentioned there, these leaks have exposed the thinking of top Middle East leaders when it comes to dealing with Iran's nuclear program. The previously secret urgings are now out in the open for everyone to read. But what lasting impact will this have on the region? Our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen, has been taking a closer look.